Bing bongy bong, bing bongy bong. This is Joe, the bearded historian. He'll tell you an interesting story. Be careful of his soldiers, they can be brats. This is Angel, she's an entity. She'll cause chaos and plant her hands at you. This is Sue, she likes spirits, not the alcohol. She's the reason this channel exists. This is David, he likes fire trucks. He's here occasionally. Bing bongy bong, bing bongy bong, bing bongy bong. We preserve his story. Cheese. Well, chips anyway. Welcome to the first Wayback Wednesday of June. Jim was going to ramble about war again because that's one of his favorite topics. Hopefully he won't mind too much. But before all that, we've got a shout out. Are you ready? I'm also working on for the shout out part 2 for the 2900. Then I gotta work on the 3000 because you people are crazy. There are too many of you, but never too many of you. We'll appreciate it. All of you. Are you ready? Here we go. Shout out time. Here's a shout out just for you. You support me, so I support you. The shout out is for our friends. Let's see who it is today. Okay. Maybe. Okay, there we go. There's Hiking on Tail, Spectral. There's Zol. There's Fican. Kimbler. Stace, Jacob, Carnival, Keep Digging, Bobby, Blistering, Blended, Graph, Jason, Mountain Inspiration, Stace, Scrapping, Wanda, Rowdy, Bobby, Sheena, let's see, Pinned, Sylvia, My Linda, Stephen, Tina, Voices very, very far in the lead. There comes Ian from the back. There's Iris. Ryan, I should say. Oh, I don't know who won. Who won? Tell me who won. Wanda won. Hold on a minute. Alright, so we've got Wanda. No, unfortunately, we have 3 Wandas. But I'm pretty sure that this is the Wanda we need today. Because she's the one who posted or commented most recently. So it's Wanda Henry, and she posts every few weeks. Hasn't posted in a little bit, but that's all right. We got some shorts. And, well, live a couple days ago, which apparently I forgot about, but participated in. Does not have a description, but that's all right. It's kind of a vlog of sorts, so you'll see a little bit of life, travels, things like that. So she's at 270. Out. Bump her up a little bit. Maybe get her to 300. Like, share, comment. Enjoy the yuckies. It's over an hour, so don't fall asleep. Alright, Bearded Historian part 506. Probably not that many, but you know.
Yeah, something like that.
I lost count.
Anyway, we lost count. If you know the count, please leave in the notes exactly where we're. We have no idea. Anyway. On today's topic of history and the date, we have an interesting topic that comes out of the Middle East. Wow, they can never keep the peace in the East. Anyway.
What fun is peace?
Peace doesn't sell very well. They try to sell it every year. Well, usually one side or the other, and either side wants to agree on it. But this happy little occasion happened to occur over by Israel.
Woo!
And as the history books went about calling it, would be known as the 6-Day War.
Doesn't seem long enough to be determined as a war.
Yeah, and that's the thing. It's kind of funny because I mean, you think about the 7 Years' War, you think about World War II, World War One. You know, they've had countries be at war for decades, and somehow this one got solved out in only 6 days. Now, the main problem that came out of this was that you had hostilities would break out between Israel and its Arab neighbors. If you ever look at a map, they're completely surrounded.
What?
You've got Beirut to the north, you've got Syria, you've got Jordan to the east, You got Saudi Arabia, you've got Egypt over to the southwest. Not a lot of people like Israel where it's presently at, which is kind of funny, but you know, it's, what do you call? Fun neighbors. And then, of course, in the middle, you also have all these Palestinians that are trying to find a place to live. Now, what basically set the table for this whole experience, in 1949, there was an armistice agreement that was signed at the end of the first Arab-Israeli war. Nice and dandy. We're not shooting at each other, sort of.
What? No.
But then, along came 1956, and tensions grew out of the Straits of Tiran that helped Israel have access to Eilat, a port at the southeast tip of Israel, escalated into what became known as the Suez Crisis. Well, during that event, Israel wound up invading Egypt over the Egyptian closure of the maritime passageways to Israeli shipping, then ultimately resulting in the reopening of the straits, as well as the deployment from the United Nations Emergency Force along the Egyptian-Israeli border. Well, in the months prior to the outbreak of the Six-Day War, tensions became dangerously heightened. Israel reiterated its post-1956 position that another Egyptian closure to Israeli shipping would be a definite casus belli. Well, in May of 1967, the Egyptian president, Gamal Abdel Nasser, announced that the straits would again be closed to Israeli vessels. Kind of like, come on, bring it. You know, well, by all means, you know. Well, as things would happen, after that crisis, Egypt agreed to the stationing of those United Nations emergency forces in the Sinai to ensure all parties would comply with the 1949 armistice agreements. In the following years, there were numerous minor border clashes between Israel and its Arab neighbors. Again, they didn't like each other very much. And particularly, there's a lot of shooting clashes with Syria. Well, in early November 1966, Syria signed a mutual defense agreement with Egypt saying, hey, come here, we'll help you. Soon after this, in response to the Palestinian Liberation Organization, or the PLO, guerrilla activity, including a mine attack that left 3 dead, the Israeli Defense Force attacked the village of As-Samu in the Jordanian-ruled West Bank. Jordanian units that engaged the Israelis were quickly beaten back. King Hussein of Jordan criticized Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser for failing to come to Jordan's aid and hiding behind the UNEF skirts. Ooh. Well, May 1967, Nasser received false reports from the Soviet Union that Israel was massing on the Syrian border. Well, Nasser began massing his troops in 2 defensive lines in the Sinai Peninsula on Israel's border on May the 16th. They basically expelled the UNAF forces from Gaza and Sinai on the 19th, and then took over the positions at Sharm el-Sheikh, or Sheikh, overlooking the Straits of Tiran. Well, Israel repeated declarations it had made in 1957 that any closure of these straits would be considered an act of war or justification for war. Basically, it would be like us closing off the San Francisco Bay to traffic into Oakland. It'd be really stupid, you know, not letting ships come into Oakland. It's a great big harbor. But
there are other harbors, right?
Somewhere. Now, Nasser went ahead and closed the straits to shipping on the 22nd and 23rd of May. Well, after the war, the U.S. President at the time, Lyndon Johnson, commented, if a single act of folly was more responsible for this explosion than any other, it was the arbitrary and dangerous announced decision that the Straits of Tiran would be closed. The right of innocent maritime passage must be preserved for all nations. Kind of a bullying thing to do, too. It's like,
no,
you're not going to let us bring in our supplies. It's one of our only ways in or out, unless we go, you know, out through the Mediterranean. And, well, if you guys close off the Suez, we're still kind of screwed there. But anyway, On May 30th, Jordan and Egypt signed a defense pact. The following day, at Jordan's invitation, the Iraqi army began deploying troops and armored units in Jordan. They were later reinforced by an Egyptian contingent. On June the 1st, Israel formed a national unity government by widening its cabinet, and on the 4th of June, the decision was made to go to war. The next morning, Israel launched Operation Focus, a large-scale surprise airstrike that launched off the six-day war. Now, before the war, Israeli pilots and ground crews had trained extensively in rapid refitting of aircraft returning from sorties, enabling a single aircraft to sortie up to 4 times a day.
Oh, wow.
That is impressive. That's like, get me off the ground, hit a target, come back, reload, off the ground, hit another target. That's kind of incredible. That's a good ground working team there. As opposed to the normal in the Arab air forces who might get off 1 or 2 sorties per day. Well, this allowed the Israeli Air Force to send several attack waves against Egyptian airfields that very first day of the war, overwhelming the Egyptian Air Force and allowing it to knock out the other Arab air forces on the same day. Now, remember, they're already looking at Syria, Egypt, Jordan, Iraqi forces were out there. They just took their air forces right off the board. That with air superiority, things get really interesting then. Now, it says this has helped contribute to the Arab belief that the IAF was helped by foreign air forces. See controversies relating to the Six-Day War. Pilots were extensively schooled about their targets, were forced to memorize every single detail, and rehearsed the operation multiple times on dummy runways in total secrecy. They were really well trained.
I'm confused.
Yeah. The Egyptians had constructed fortified defenses in the Sinai. These designs were based on the assumption that an attack would come along the few roads leading through the desert rather than through the difficult desert terrain. I've seen pictures of what the Sinai was like. I can't imagine fighting it over the desert. It's kind of crazy. They had, specific roads, but apparently the Israelis decided not to follow these common directions,
They wanted to wander.
Yeah.
Don't judge them.
Yeah. So the Israelis chose not to risk attacking the Egyptian defenses head-on, and instead surprised them from an unexpected direction. Well, now, a guy named Jane Reston, writing for the New York Times, noted, in discipline, training, morale, equipment, and general competence, Nasser's army and the other Arab forces, without the direct assistance of the Soviet Union, are no match for the Israelis. Even with 50,000 troops and the best of his generals and air force in Yemen, he has not been able to work his way in that small and primitive country. Even with the help of the Congo rebels, was a flop. Nasser had problems. Well, on the eve of the war, Israel believed it could win a war in 3 to 4 days. The U.S. estimated Israel would need 7 to 10 days to win, with British estimates supporting the U.S. view. Now, armies, this is where it gets kind of interesting because, again, one country versus 4, 5. The Israeli army had a total strength, including reservists, of about 264,000. Not a lot, but they trained hard, constantly in a state of readiness. Said this number couldn't be sustained for a long conflict, as the reservists were vital to civilian life. Now, Jordan's forces on the West Bank, Israel deployed about 40,000 troops and 200 tanks, 8 brigades. Israel's Central Command forces consisted of 5 brigades. The first 2 were permanently stationed near Jerusalem, and were the Jerusalem Brigade and the mechanized Harel Brigade. Mordecai Gur's 55th Paratroopers Brigade were summoned from the Sinai front. The 10th Armored Brigade was stationed north of the West Bank, and the Israeli Northern Command comprised a division of 3 brigades led by Major General Elad Peled, which was stationed in the Jezreel Valley to the north of the West Bank. Now, on the eve of the war, Egypt massed approximately 100,000 of its 160,000 troops in the Sinai, including all 7 of its divisions, 4 infantry, 2 armored, and 1 mechanized, 4 independent infantry brigades, and 4 independent armored brigades. Now, over a third of these soldiers were already veterans in Egypt's continuing intervention in the North Yemen civil war, and another third were reservists. These forces had about 950 tanks, 1,100 APCs, and more than 1,000 artillery pieces. So they had a lot of equipment.
No.
Now, Syria, it had an army of about 75,000 and was deployed along the border with Israel. Now, Professor David W. Lesh wrote that one would be hard-pressed to find a military less prepared for war with a clearly superior foe, since Syria's army had been decimated in the months and years prior through coup and attempted coups that had resulted in a series of purges, fracturings, and uprisings within the armed forces. They were basically fighting over themselves.
Oh, I want to fight with myself.
Yeah, it makes you really hard to trust the guy next to you who might shoot you. But the Jordanian armed forces included 11 brigades, totaling 55,000 troops. 9 brigades were deployed to the West Bank, including the elite armored 40th and 2 of the Jordan Valley. Now, they possessed sizable numbers of the M113 APCs and were equipped with some 300 modern Western tanks. About 250 were U.S. M48 Pattons. There was also about 12 battalions of artillery, 6 batteries of 81 millimeter and 120 millimeter mortars, a paratrooper battalion trained in the new U.S.-built school, and a new battalion of mechanized infantry. The Jordanian army was a long-term service professional army, relatively well-equipped and well-trained. Israeli post-war briefing said that the Jordanian staff acted professionally, but was always left half a step behind the Israeli moves. The small Royal Jordanian Air Force consisted of only 24 British-made Hawker Hunter fighters, 6 transport aircraft, and 2 helicopters. That's not a lot of military strength. According to the Israelis, the Hawker Hunter was essentially on par with the French-built Dassault Mirage 3, the IAF's best plane. Now, 100 Iraqi tanks and an infantry division were ready near the Jordanian border. 2 squadrons of Iraqi fighter aircraft, Hawker Hunters, and MiG-21s were rebased adjacent to the Jordanian border. Now, in the weeks leading up to the Six-Day War, Saudi Arabia also mobilized forces for deployment to the Jordanian front. A Saudi infantry battalion entered Jordan on the 6th of June, followed by another on the 8th. Both were based in Jordan's southernmost city, Mayan. By the 17th of June, the Saudi contingent in Jordan had grown to include a single infantry brigade, a tank company, 2 artillery batteries, a heavy mortar company, and a maintenance and support unit. By the end of July 1967, a 2nd tank company and a 3rd artillery battery had been added. These forces would remain in Jordan until the end of 1977, when they were recalled for re-equipment and retraining in the Iraq region near the Dead Sea. So, again, nice numbers. Guess what? They weren't involved in the battle. The battle was over in 6 days. Now, the Arab Air Forces, this is the crazy part, they were reinforced by aircraft from Libya, Algeria, Morocco, Kuwait, and Saudi Arabia to make up for the massive losses suffered on that first day of the war. They were also aided by volunteer pilots from Pakistan, acting in an independent capacity. PAF pilots like Saiful Azam shot down several Israeli planes. So, here's even more countries that are all bent out of shape and going after Israel. Now, weapons, with the exception of Jordan, the Arabs relied principally on Soviet weaponry. Remember, this was during the Cold War. We were trying to help our allies. The Soviets were trying to sell their stuff as fast as they could make it. You talk about AK-47s, they were flying off the racks. Jordan's army was equipped with American weaponry, which is kind of funny.
What? No.
And its air force was composed primarily of British aircraft.
Oh, they're just mixed and matching, aren't they?
Exactly. Kind of kit bashing. Egypt had by far the largest and most modern of all the Arab air forces, consisting of about 420 combat aircraft, all of them Soviet-built and with a large number of top-of-the-line MiG-21s. A particular concern to the Israelis were the 30 Tu-16 Badger medium bombers capable of inflicting heavy damage on Israeli military and civilian centers. Israeli weapons were mainly, again, of Western origin. Its air force was comprised principally of French aircraft, while its armored units were mostly of British and American design and manufacture. Some light infantry weapons, including the ubiquitous Uzi, were of Israeli origin. Now, going through the specifics of, what vehicles were being used to get the AFVs, Egypt, Syria, and Iraq were using T-34s, T-54s, T-55s, and the Su-100s, 152s. They also had vintage World War II Soviet self-propelled guns. Jordan was using the M47s and 48s, the M48A1 Patton tanks. Interestingly enough, they had units that ranked back to German World War II units, including a Panzer IV. Now, the Israelis, they had the M50s and M51 Shermans, M48A3 Pattons, Centurions, the AMX-13s, M32 tank recovery vehicles, and the Centurion was actually upgraded with the British 105mm L7 gun prior to the war. The Sherman also underwent extensive modifications, including a larger 105mm velocity gun, and the French gun redesigned turret, wider tracks, more armor, and upgraded engine and suspension. So they weren't just happy with just a regular, tank. They took these things out, broke them down, and said, let's make it better. Which is kind of scary for somebody that's just borrowing a unit. Or we're going to get this from France, we're going to get this over here from America, we're going to get this over here from the British. Let's tinker, class.
Ooh.
Now, artilleries, the Arabs had the M1937 howitzer, BM21, the D30 howitzer, the M1954 field gun, and a M52 105mm self-propelled howitzer, which was used by Jordan. Israelis had the M50 self-propelled howitzer and the Machman 160mm self-propelled mortar, a 57 Priest, Oboser D 155mm Model 50, and the AMX 105mm self-propelled howitzer. So, congratulations, we're going to shoot at each other over the wall.
Woo.
The Israelis, when it came to aircraft, again, they had the Dassault Mirage 3, Dassault Super Mystery, Sud Aviation Valtor, the Mystery 4, Dassault Ouragan, the Faga Magister, and trainers outfitted for attack missions, the Nord 2501 IS military cargo plane. So, fun stuff across the board. The aircraft the Arabs, of course, had to work with was your mid-class, your 21, 19, the 17, the Su-7B, the Tu-16, the IL-28, IL-18, IL-14, AN-12, the Hawker Hunter, which was primarily used by the Jordan Iraqi Air Forces. And then, of course, infantry weapons. The Arabs used the Port Said submachine gun, AK-47, RPK, RPD, the B-10, the B-11 recoilless rifles, while the Israelis, interestingly enough, they both used AK-47s, the M2 Brownings, the Uzi, the FN FAL, FN MAG, Nord SS.11, the RL-83 blind sight anti-tank infantry weapon, and Jeep-mounted 106mm recoilless rifles. Now, initial attack for Operation Focus, the first most critical move of the conflict, again, was this surprise Israeli attack. They hit the Egyptian Air Force initially. Both Egypt and Israel announced that they had been attacked by the other country. On the 5th of June at 7:45 Israeli time, civil defense sirens sounded all over Israel, and the IAF launched Operation Focus. All but 12 of nearly 200 operational jets launched a mass attack at the Egyptian airfields. That's a lot of freaking aircraft. Now, the Egyptians' defensive infrastructure was extremely poor, and no airfields were yet equipped with hardened aircraft shelters capable of protecting the warplanes. Most of Israelis' warplanes headed out over the Mediterranean Sea, flew low to avoid radar detection before turning towards Egypt. Others went right over the Red Sea. Now, meanwhile, the Egyptians hindered their own defense by effectively shutting down their entire air defense system. Yep. They were worried that the rebel Egyptian forces would shoot down the plane carrying Field Marshal Abdel Hakim Amir and Lieutenant General Sadiq Mahoud, who were en route from Al-Mazah to Bir Tamana in the Sinai to meet the commanders of the troops stationed there. It didn't make a great deal of difference, as the Israeli pilots came in below Egyptian radar cover and well below the lowest point at which an SA-2 surface-to-air missile batteries could bring down any aircraft.
Oops.
Now, although the powerful Jordanian radar facility Al-Jud detected waves of aircraft approaching Egyptian, and reported the code word for war to these Egyptian commanders, Egyptian command and communications problems prevented the warnings from reaching the targeted airfields.
Whoops.
So the Israelis employed their mixed strategy attack, bombing and strafing runs against the planes parked on the ground, and bombing to disable runways with special tarmac shredding penetration bombs developed jointly with France. So much for America helping them on that run.
That wasn't going to do anything.
Yeah. Leaving the surviving aircraft unable to take off. Guys, we can't use the runway. It's slightly out of action. Well, completely.
Nah.
Now, the runway at Arish airfield was spared as the Israelis expected to turn it into a military airport for their transports after the war. Surviving aircraft were taken out later in successive waves. The operation was more successful than expected, catching the Egyptians by surprise and destroying virtually all of their air force on the ground, with few Israeli losses. Only 4 unarmed Egyptian training flights were in the air when the strike began. A total of 338 Egyptian aircraft were destroyed, and 100 pilots were killed, although the number of aircraft lost by the Egyptians is disputed. Now, among the planes lost were all 30 of the Tu-16s, 27 out of the 40 IL-28 bombers, 12 Su-7 fighter bombers, over 90 MiG-21s, 20 MiG-19s, 25 MiG-17 fighters, and around 32 transport planes and helicopters. In addition, the Egyptian radars and SAM missiles were also attacked and destroyed. The Israelis in total lost 19 planes, including 2 destroyed in air-to-air combat and 13 downed by anti-aircraft artillery. One Israeli plane, which was damaged and unable to break radio silence, was shot down by Israeli Hawk missiles after it strayed over the Negev Nuclear Research Center. Another was destroyed by an exploding Egyptian bomber. Oof. Now, the attack guaranteed Israel air supremacy for the rest of the war. Attacks by other Arab forces, Israel took place later in the day as hostilities broke out on the other fronts. With a large number of Arab aircraft claimed destroyed by Israel on that day were at first regarded as greatly exaggerated by the Western press, but the fact that the Egyptian Air Force, along with the other Arab air forces attacked by Israel, made practically no appearance for the remaining days of the conflict, proving that the numbers were most likely authentic. All throughout the war, Israel aircraft continued strafing Arab airfield runways to prevent their return to usability. Meanwhile, Egyptian state-run radio had reported an Egyptian victory, falsely claiming that 70 Israeli planes had been downed on the first day of fighting. Does it sound like somebody else spouting numbers without any proof?
It's like numbers.
Yeah. Now,
We don't need proof.
Of course not. You know, witnesses? Who needs witnesses?
We're just going to make shit up.
Yeah.
It's more fun.
Well, usually. Now, going on down to the Sinai and the Gaza Strip, you got the Egyptian forces consisting of 7 divisions, 4 armored, 2 infantry, and 1 mechanized. Overall, Egypt had about 100,000 troops and 90 to 950 tanks in the Sinai, backed up by 1,100 APCs and 1,000 artillery pieces. Decent numbers. This arrangement was thought to be based on the Soviet doctrine, which made mobile armor units at strategic depth providing dynamic defense while infantry units engaged in defensive battles. Well, Israel's forces concentrated on the border with Egypt included 6 armored brigades, 1 infantry brigade, 1 mechanized infantry brigade, 3 paratrooper brigades, giving them a total of about 70,000 men and 700 tanks. So, numbered-wise, they were a little lower than Egypt. They had massed on the border the night before the war, camouflaging themselves and observing radio silence before being ordered to move. Well, now the Israeli plan was to surprise the Egyptian forces in both timing, with the attack exactly coinciding with the IAF strike, and in location, attacking via northern and central Sinai routes, as opposed to the Egyptian expectations of a repeat of the 1956 war, when the IDF attacked via the central and southern routes, and nothing, using a combined force of flanking approach rather than direct tank assaults. As in, you expect us to go this way? Ooh, silly people. Now, June 5th, 7:50 a.m., the northernmost Israeli division, consisting of 3 brigades and commanded by Major General Israel Tal, one of Israel's most prominent armored commanders, crossed the border at 2 points, opposite Nahal Oz and south of Khan Yunis. Now, they advanced swiftly, holding fire to prolong the element of surprise. Tal's forces assaulted the Rafah Gap, an 11-kilometer stretch containing the shortest of 3 main routes through the Sinai towards El Qantara and the Suez Canal. Now, the Egyptians had 4 divisions in the area, backed by minefields, pillboxes, underground bunkers, hidden gun emplacements, and trenches. The terrain on either side of the route was impassable. The Israeli plan was to hit the Egyptians at selected key points with concentrated armor, while Tal's advance was led by the 7th Armored Brigade under Colonel Shomel Gonen. The Israeli plan called for the 7th Brigade to outflank Khan Yunis from the north, and the 60th Armored Brigade under Colonel Bisham Amram would advance from the south. These 2 brigades would link up and surround Khan Yunis, while the paratroopers would take Rafah. Gonen entrusted the breakthrough to a single battalion of his brigade. Now, initially, advance was met with light resistance, as Egyptian intelligence had concluded this was a diversion to the main attack. Well, as Gonen's lead battalion advanced, it suddenly came under intense fire, taking heavy losses. A 2nd battalion was brought up, but it was also pinned down. Meanwhile, the 60th Brigade became bogged down in the sand, while the paratroopers had trouble navigating through the dunes.
Whoops.
The Israelis would continue to press their attack, and despite heavy losses, cleared the Egyptian positions and reached Khan Yunis railway junction in a little over 4 hours. Well, Gonen's brigade then advanced 9 miles to Rafah in twin columns. Rafah itself was circumvented, and the Israelis attacked Sheikh Zuweld, 13 kilometers to the southwest, which was defended by 2 brigades. Though inferior in numbers and equipment, the Egyptians were deeply entrenched and camouflaged. The Israelis were pinned down by fierce Egyptian resistance and called in air and artillery support to enable their lead elements to advance. Well, many of the Egyptians abandoned their positions after the commander and several of the staff were killed.
Oops.
Now, the Israelis broke through with their tank-led assaults, but Avram's forces misjudged the Egyptians' flank and were pinned down between strongholds before they were extracted after several hours. By nightfall, the Israelis had finished mopping up resistance. Israeli forces had taken significant losses, with Colonel Gonen later telling reporters that we left many of our dead soldiers in Rafah and many burnt-out tanks. The Egyptians would suffer some 2,000 casualties, while losing 40 tanks. On the 5th of June, with the road open, Israeli forces continued advancing towards Arish. Already by late afternoon, elements of the 79th Armored Battalion had charged through the 11-kilometer-long Jeridai Defile, a narrow pass defended by well-in-place troops of the Egyptian 112th Infantry Brigade. In fierce fighting, it saw the pass change hands several times, with Israelis charging through the position. The Egyptians suffered heavy casualties and tank losses, while the Israelis' losses stood at 66 dead, 93 wounded, and 28 tanks. Emerging at the western end, Israeli forces advanced to the outskirts of Arish. As it reached the outskirts, Tal's division also consolidated its hold on Rafah and Khan Yunis. The following day, the Israeli forces on the outskirts of Arish were reinforced by 7th Brigade, which fought its way through the Durrani Pass. After receiving supplies via airdrop, the Israelis entered the city and captured the airport at 7:50 a.m. Wake-up call! The Israelis entered the city at 8 a.m. Company Commander Yossi Peled recounted that Al-Arish was totally quiet and desolate. Suddenly, the city turned into a madhouse. Shots came at us from every alley, every corner, every window and house. An IDF record stated that clearing the city was hard fighting. The Egyptians fired from the rooftops, from balconies and windows. They dropped grenades into our half-tracks and blocked the streets with trucks. Our men threw grenades back and crushed the trucks with their tanks. Godin sent additional units to Arish, and the city was eventually taken. Brigadier General Avraham Yoffe's assignment was to penetrate Sinai south to Tal's forces and north to Sharon's. Yoffe's attack allowed Tal to complete the capture of the Durrani Defile, Khan Yunis. All of them were taken after fierce fighting. Godin subsequently dispatched a force of tanks, infantry, and engineers under Colonel Yasser Granit to continue down the Mediterranean coast towards the Suez Canal, while the second force, led by Godin himself, turned south and captured Bir Lafan and Jabal Libni. Now, further south, on the 6th of June, the Israeli 38th Armored Division under Major General Ariel Sharon, later a powerful political person, assaulted Katif, a heavily fortified area defended by Egyptian 2nd Infantry Division under Major General Saad Niglub, though Niglub was actually absent, of Soviet World War II armor, which included 90 T-34-85 tanks, 22 Su-100 tank destroyers, and about 16,000 men. The Israelis had about 14,000 men and 150 post-World War II tanks, including the AMX-13s, Centurions, and the M50 Super Shermans, modified M4 Sherman tanks. Now, the two armored brigades, in the meantime, under Abraham Yoff, slipped across the border through sandy waste that Egyptian had left undefended because they were considered impassable. Let's go that way.
Okay.
Simultaneously, Sharon's tanks from the west were to engage the Egyptian forces at Katif Ridge and block any reinforcements. Israeli infantry would clear the three trenches, while heliborne paratroopers would land behind the Egyptian lines and silence their artillery. An armored thrust would be made at Al-Qasama to unnerve and isolate its garrison. As Sharon's division advanced into the Sinai, Egyptian forces staged successful delaying actions at Tarat Tarfa, and Hill 181. An Israeli jet was downed by anti-aircraft fire, and Sharon's forces came under heavy shelling as they advanced from the north and the west. The Israelis' advance, which had to cope with extensive minefields, took a large number of casualties. A column of Israeli tanks managed to penetrate the northern flank of Abu Aguila, and by dusk all units were in position. The Israelis then brought up 90 105mm and 155mm artillery cannons for a preparatory barrage, while civilian buses brought reserve infantrymen under Colonel Yukatil Adam and helicopters arrived to ferry the paratroopers. The movements were unobserved by the Egyptians, who were preoccupied with Israeli probes along their perimeter. As the night fell, Israeli assault troops lit flashlights. Each battalion had a different color to prevent friendly fire instances. At 10 p.m., the Israeli artillery began a barrage on Katif, firing some 6,000 shells in less than 20 minutes. That's a lot of shells coming down.
That is a lot of shells coming
crap!
down.
Now, the most concentrated artillery barrage in Israel's history, Israeli tanks assaulted the northernmost Egyptian defenses and were largely successful. Though an entire armored brigade was stalled by mines, had only one mine clearance tank. Israeli infantrymen assaulted the triple line of trenches in the east, and to the west, paratroopers commanded by Colonel Danny Matt landed behind Egyptian lines, though half of the helicopters got lost and never found the battlefield, while others were unable to land due to mortar fire. Those that successfully landed on target destroyed Egyptian artillery and ammunition dumps and separated gun crews from their batteries, sowing enough confusion to significantly reduce Egyptian artillery fire. Egyptian reinforcements from Jabal Lebni advanced towards Katif in a counterattack, but failed to reach their objective, being subjected to the heavy air attacks in encountering Israeli lodgements on the roads. Egyptian commanders then called in artillery attacks on their own positions. The Israelis accomplished and sometimes exceeded their overall plan and had largely succeeded by the following day. The Egyptians suffered about 2,000 casualties, while the Israelis only lost 42 and 140 wounded. Really off-kilter numbers there.
Slightly.
No, U.S. attack allowed Sharon to complete the capture of Katif after fierce fighting. The main thrust at Katif was stalled due to the mines and craters. After IDF engineers had cleared the path by 4 p.m., Israeli and Egyptian tanks engaged in fierce combat, often at ranges as close as 10 yards. The battle ended with an Israeli victory, with 40 Egyptian and 19 Israeli tanks destroyed. Meanwhile, Israeli infantry finished clearing out the Egyptian trenches, with Israeli casualties standing at 14 dead and 41 wounded, and Egyptian casualties at 300 dead and 100 taken prisoner. Now, further south on the 5th of June, the 8th Armored Brigade under Colonel Albert Mandler initially positioned a ruse to draw off Egyptian forces from the real invasion routes attacked by fortified bunkers at Kotila, a strategically valuable position whose capture would make Mandler to block reinforcements from reaching Katif and join Sharon's upcoming attack on the Kill. The defending Egyptian battalion, outnumbered and outgunned, fiercely resisted the attack, hitting several Israeli tanks. Most of the defenders were killed, and only 3 Egyptian tanks, one of them damaged, survived by nightfall. Mandler's forces had taken Kotila. Now, with the exceptions of Rafah and Khan Yunis, Israeli forces had initially avoided entering the Gaza Strip. Israeli Defense Minister Moshe Dayan had expressly forbidden entry into the area. After Palestinian positions in Gaza opened fire on the Negev settlements of Niran and Kisfern, IDF Chief of Staff Yitzhak Rabin, another political name, overrode Dayan's instructions and ordered the 11th Mechanized Brigade under Colonel Yehuda Ratzif to enter the Strip. The forces immediately met with heavy artillery fire and fierce resistance from the Palestinian forces and remnants of the Egyptian forces from Rafah. By sunset, the Israelis had taken the strategically vital Al-Manatar Ridge overlooking Gaza City, but were beaten back from the city itself. Some 70 Israelis were killed, along with Israeli journalist Ben Oyserman and American journalist Paul Schutzer. 12 members of the UNEF were also killed. On the war's second day, the 6th of June, Israelis were bolstered by the 35th Paratrooper Brigade under Colonel Raphael Eitan, who took Gaza City along with the entire Strip. The fighting was fierce and accounted for nearly half of all Israeli casualties on the southern front. Gaza rapidly fell to the Israelis. Meanwhile, on the 6th of June, 2 Israeli reserve brigades under Yaf, each equipped with 100 tanks, penetrated the Sinai south of Tal's division and north of Sharon's, capturing the road junctions of Abu Agila, Bir Lafan, and Arish, taking all of them before midnight. Two Egyptian armored brigades counterattacked, and a fierce battle took place until the following morning. The Egyptians were beaten back by fierce resistance, coupled with airstrikes sustaining heavy tank losses. Then they would flee west towards Jabal al-Bid. Again, the air power became critical because it was something the Egyptians couldn't exactly call and say, "Hey, can you bring in, a MiG-21? We're getting our butts kicked over here."
They can't do that?
No, they're all burning in the sands. Now, the Egyptian army, during the ground fighting, remnants of this Egyptian Air Force attacked Israeli ground forces but took losses from the Air Force from the Israelis and from Israeli anti-aircraft units. Throughout the last 4 days, the Egyptian aircraft flew 150 sorties against Israeli units in the Sinai. Now, many of the Egyptian units remained intact and could have tried to prevent the Israelis from reaching the Suez Canal or engaged in combat in an attempt to reach the canal, but when the Egyptian Field Marshal Abdel Hakim Amir heard about the fall of Abu Agila, he panicked and ordered all units in the Sinai to retreat. This order pretty much effectively meant the defeat of Egypt. Meanwhile, President Nasser, having learned of the results of the Israeli airstrikes, decided to gather with Field Marshal Amir to order the general retreat from the Sinai within 24 hours. No detailed instructions were given concerning the manner and sequence of the withdrawal. Well, as the Egyptian columns were retreating, of course, the Israeli aircraft and artillery would attack them, destroying targets. Israel jets would use napalm during their sorties, and the attacks destroyed hundreds of vehicles and caused heavy casualties. At Jabal al-Libni, retreating Egyptian soldiers were fired on by their own artillery. Oops. At Nil Gafarka, the Egyptians fiercely resisted advancing artillery forces, knocking out 3 tanks and 8 half-tracks and killing 20 soldiers. Due to the Egyptians' retreat, Israeli High Command decided not to pursue the Egyptian units, but rather to bypass them and destroy them in the mountainous passes of the western Sinai. Therefore, in the following 2 days, the 6th and 7th of June, all 3 Israeli divisions, Sharon and Tal, were reinforced by an armored brigade each, rushed westwards and reached the passes. Sharon's division went first, southward and then westward, via Bekel to Mitla Pass with air support. It was joined there by parts of Yofi's division, while its other units blocked the Guinea Pass. These passes became killing grounds for the Egyptians, who ran into waiting Israeli positions, suffering heavy losses in both soldiers and vehicles. According to Egyptian diplomat Mahmoud Raid, 10,000 men were killed in 1 day alone, and many others died from thirst. Tal's units stopped at various points along the length of the Suez Canal. Now, Israel's blocking action was partially successful. Only the Guinea Pass was captured before the Egyptians approached it, but in other places the Egyptian units managed to pass through and cross the canal to safety. Due to the haste of the Egyptian retreat, though, soldiers often abandoned weapons, military equipment, and hundreds of vehicles. Many Egyptian soldiers were cut off from their units, had to walk about 200 kilometers or 120 miles on foot before reaching the Suez Canal with limited supplies of food and water and were exposed to intense heat. Congratulations, guys, you're microwaving.
It is a small hike.
Yeah. Now, thousands died due to this result. Many Egyptian soldiers chose instead to surrender to the Israelis, who eventually exceeded their capabilities to provide for prisoners. As a result, they began directing soldiers towards the Suez Canal and only imprisoned high-ranking officers, who were expected to be exchanged for captured Israeli pilots. According to some accounts, during the Egyptian retreat of the Sinai, a unit of Soviet Marines based on a Soviet warship in Port Said at the same time came ashore and attempted to cross the Suez Canal eastward. The Soviet force was reportedly decimated by an Israeli air attack and lost 17 dead and 34 wounded. Among the wounded was the commander, Lieutenant Commander Viktor Shevchenko. During the offensive, the Israeli Navy landed 6 combat divers from the Shret 13 Naval Commando Unit to infiltrate the Alexandria harbor. The divers sank the Egyptian minesweeper before being taken prisoner. Shat 13 commandos also infiltrated the Point Sad harbor, but found no ships there. A planned commando raid against the Syrian Navy never materialized, and both Egyptian and Israeli warships made movements at sea to intimidate the other side throughout the war, but didn't engage each other. Israeli warships and aircrafts hunted for Egyptian submarines throughout the war. Well, only came the 7th.
What?
Israeli began its attack on Sharm el-Sheikh. The Israeli Navy started an operation with a probe of the Egyptian naval defenses. An aerial reconnaissance flight found the area was less defended than originally thought. At about 4:30 a.m., 3 Israeli missile boats opened fire on Egyptian shore batteries, while paratroopers and commandos boarded helicopters and Nordas transport planes for an assault on El-Tur, as Chief of Staff Rabin had convinced it was too risky to land directly at Sharm el-Sheikh. The city had been largely abandoned the day before, and reports from the air and naval forces finally convinced Rabin to divert the aircraft to Sharm el-Sheikh. There, the Israelis engaged in a pitched battle with the Egyptians and took the city, killing 20 Egyptian soldiers and taking 8 more prisoners. At 12:15 p.m., the defense minister, Dayan, announced the Straits of Tiran constituted an international waterway open to all ships without restriction. So congratulations, Nasser. We got our harbor back.
Woo!
On the 8th of June, Israel completed the capture of the Sinai by sending infantry units to Ras Sudur on the western coast of the peninsula. Several tactical elements made the swift Israeli advance possible. The surprise attack, it quickly gave Israeli Air Force complete air superiority over the Egyptian Air Force. The determined implementation of an innovative battle plan, and the lack of coordination among Egyptian troops. These factors would prove decisive elements in Israel's other fronts as well. Now, on to part 2. The joys of the West Bank. Now, King Hussein gave control of his army to Egypt on the 1st of June, on which date the Egyptian general Riyad arrived in Amman to take control of the Jordanian military.
Hi.
Egyptian military field marshal Amir used the confusion of the first hours of conflict to send a cable to Amman that he was victorious. He claimed as evidence a radar sighting of a squadron of Israeli aircraft returning from bombing raids in Egypt, which he said was an Egyptian aircraft en route to attack Israel. In this cable, seen shortly before 9 a.m., Riyadh was ordered to attack. So, one of the Jordanian brigades stationed in the West Bank was sent to the Hebron area in order to link with the Egyptians. The IDF's strategic plan was to remain on the defensive along the Jordanian front to enable focus in the expected campaign against Egypt. Well, intermittent machine gun exchanges began taking place in Jerusalem around 9:30 a.m., and the fighting gradually escalated as the Jordanians introduced mortars and recoilless rifle fire. Under the orders from General Narkis, the Israelis responded only with small arms fire, firing in a flat trajectory to avoid hitting civilians, holy sites, or the Old City. At 10 a.m. on the 5th of June, the Jordanian army began shelling Israel. 2 batteries of 155mm long-tall cannons opened fire on the suburbs of Tel Aviv and Ramat David Air Base. The commanders of these batteries were instructed to lay a 2-hour barrage against military and civilian settlements in central Israel. Some shells hit the outskirts of Tel Aviv. So right there, they weren't worried about civilians.
No.
By 10:30 a.m., Eshkol had sent a message via Audible to King Hussein promising not to initiate any action against Jordan if it stayed out of the war. King Hussein replied that it was too late and the die was cast. Well, at 11:15 a.m., Jordanian howitzers began a 6,000 shell barrage at the Israeli Jerusalem. The Jordanians initially targeted Kibbutz Ramat Rachel in the south and Mount Scopus in the north, then ranged the city center and outlying neighborhoods. Military installations, the Prime Minister's residence, and the Kesnet compound were also targeted. Jordanian forces shelled the Beit Hasnasi in the biblical zoo, killing 15 civilians. Israeli civilian casualties totaled some 20 dead and 1,000 wounded. Some 900 buildings were damaged, including the Hassan in Karim Hospital, which had its Shargali main windows destroyed. So, firing of hospitals. Not going, Jordan.
We're not supposed to do that?
No, they're supposed to be considered safe.
Oh.
Yeah. Around midday, 8 Iraqi Hawker hunters attacked the Kafar Sikran airfield, destroying a Nor Atlas transport aircraft and a Piper Super Cub. 4 Jordanian hunters also hit a factory hall in Netyana, killing 1 civilian and wounding 7. Well, when the Israeli cabinet convened to decide on a plan of action, Ilan and Meghan Begin argued that this was the opportunity to take the old city of Jerusalem. But Eshkol decided to refer any decision until Moshe Dayan and Yeshek Rabin could be consulted. Uzi Narkis made proposals for military action, including the capture of Latrun, but the cabinet turned him down. Dayan rejected multiple requests from Narkis for permission to mount an infantry assault towards Mount Scopus, but sanctioned some limited retaliatory actions. Well, shortly before 12:30, the Israeli Air Force attacked Jordan's 2 air bases. The Hawker hunters were refueling at the time of the attack. The Israeli aircraft attacked the 2 A's, the first of which cratered the runways and then knocked out the control towers, while the second wave destroyed all 21 of Jordan's Hawker hunter fighters, along with 6 transport aircraft and 2 helicopters. 1 Israeli jet was shot down by ground fire. So, well, you guys have an Air Force. You have nothing. 3 Israeli Valkyries were also attacked the H-3 an airfield in western Iraq used by the Iraqi Air Force. During the attack, 3 MiG-21s, 1 Hunter, 1 de Havilland Dove, and 1 Antonov AN-12 were destroyed on the ground. They also damaged the runway, although it was repaired by the next morning. The Jordanian radar facility at Al-Jud was also destroyed in an Israeli airstrike. The Israeli Thalib Magister jets attacked the Jordanian 40th Brigade with rockets as it moved south from the Dabila Bridge. Dozens of tanks were knocked out. A convoy of 26 trucks carrying ammunition was destroyed, but that went up brightly. In Jerusalem, Israel responded to the Jordanian shelling with a missile strike that devastated the Jordanian positions. The Israeli used the El missile, a surface-to-air missile deployed jointly with France in secret. Now, the next morning, 3 Iraqi Hawker hunters attacked a group of tanks in the process of refueling next to the road between Nazareth and Haifa. An Iraqi Tupolev Tu-16 also bombed a military installation 10 kilometers southeast of Afula, killing 2 Israeli soldiers, with another attacked Netyana and Ramat David Air Base before being shot down near the Medigo airfield. The aircraft crashed into a military storage complex, hid in a forest, killing its crew and 16 Israeli soldiers. 4 Israeli Venateurs, escorted by 2 Mirages, re-attacked the H-3 airfield, resulting in 1 Hunter crashing on takeoff and a Hunter and an M21 being damaged in air combat. On the 7th of June, 4 Venateurs, escorted by 4 Mirages, attacked the A-3 airfield for a 3rd time. This resulted in an air combat with Hunters piloted by Iraqis, as well as a Jordanian and a Pakistani pilot, Soful Azam. 1 Iraqi Hunter was shot down and its pilot killed, while the Israelis lost 2 Venateurs and 1 Mirage, with 3 crewmen dead and 2 taken prisoner. Now, the Jordanian battalion advanced up the Government House Ridge and dug into the perimeter of the Government House, the headquarters of the United Nations observers, and opened fire on Ramat Rachel, the Allenby barracks, and the Jewish section of Abu Tor with mortars and recoilless rifles. UN observers fiercely protested the incursion into the neutral zone. Oh, how dare you?
Nope.
The several manhandled a Jordanian machine gun out of the government house after the crew had set it up on the 2nd floor window. They were using UN territory for shooting at people. Charming. So much for respecting the UN authority, right? Now, after the Jordanians occupied Jebel Makabur, an advanced patrol was sent out and approached Ramat Rachel, where they came under fire from 4 civilians, including the wife of the director, who was armed with old Czech-made weapons. The immediate Israeli response was an offensive to retake the government house and its ridge. The Jerusalem Brigade's Reserve Battalion 161, under Lieutenant Colonel Asher Drizzen, was given the task. Drizzen had 2 light infantry companies and 8 tanks under his command, several of which broke down and became stuck in the mud at Ramat Rachel, leaving 3 for the assault. The Jordanians mounted a fierce resistance, knocking out 2 tanks. The Israelis broke through the compound's western gate and began clearing the buildings with grenades before General Odd Bull, commander of the UN observers, compelled the Israelis to hold their fire, telling them that the Jordanians had already fled. The Israelis proceeded to take the Antenna Hill directly behind the government house and clear out a series of bunkers to the west and south. The fighting, often conducted hand-to-hand, continued for nearly 4 hours before the surviving Jordanians fell back to trenches behind the Hitton Brigade, which were steadily overwhelmed. By 6:30 a.m., the Jordanians had retreated to Bethlehem, suffering about 100 casualties. All but 10 of Dresden's soldiers were casualties, and Dresden himself was wounded 3 times. So, during the late afternoon of the 5th of June, the Israelis launched an offensive to encircle Jerusalem, which lasted into the following day. During the night, they were supported by intense tank and artillery mortar fire to soften up the Jordanian positions, searchlights placed on top of the Labor Federation building, then the tallest in Israeli Jerusalem, exposed and blinded the Jordanians. The Jerusalem Brigade moved south of Jerusalem, while the mechanized Harel Brigade and the 55th Paratroopers Brigade under Mordecai Gur encircled it from the north. A combined force of tanks and paratroopers crossed the no man's land near the Mandelbaum Gate. Gur's 66th Paratroop Battalion approached the fortified police academy, and the Israelis used Bangalore torpedoes to blast their way through the barbed wire, leading up to the position while exposed and under heavy fire. With the aid of 2 tanks borrowed from the Jerusalem Brigade, they captured the police academy. After receiving reinforcements, they moved up to attack Ammunition Hill. What a name. The Jordanian defenders...
Did they have ammunition up there?
Huh?
I said, did they have ammunition up there?
No, bubblegum.
Darn it, they misnamed it.
Yeah, no. The Jordanian defenders, who were heavily dug in, fiercely resisted the attack, and all of the Israeli officers, except for 2 company commanders, were killed, and the fighting was mostly led by individual soldiers. The fighting was conducted at close quarters, in trenches and bunkers, and was often hand-to-hand. The Israelis captured the position after 4 hours of heavy fighting. During this battle, 36 Israeli and 71 Jordanian soldiers were killed. Even after the fighting on Ammunition Hill was ended, Israeli soldiers were forced to remain in the trenches due to Jordanian sniper fire from Gavat Hefimon until the Harel Brigade overran that outpost in the afternoon. Now, 66th Battalion subsequently drove east and linked up with the Israeli enclave at Mount Scopus and its Hebrew University campus. Gur's other battalions, the 71st and 28th, captured the other Jordanian positions around the American colony, despite being short on men and equipment and having come under Jordanian mortar bombardment while waiting for the signal to advance. At the same time, the IDF's 4th Brigade attacked the fortress at Latrun, which the Jordanians had abandoned due to heavy Israeli tank fire. The mechanized Harel Brigade attacked Har Adar, but 7 tanks were knocked out by mines, forcing the infantry to mount an assault without armored cover. The Israeli soldiers advanced under heavy fire, jumping between rocks to avoid mines, and fighting was conducted at close quarters with knives and bayonets. Well, the Jordanians fell back after a battle that left 2 Israeli and 8 Jordanian soldiers dead, and the Israeli forces advancing through Mount Huron towards Ramallah, taking 4 fortified villages along the way. By evening, the brigade arrived in Ramallah. Meanwhile, the 163rd Infantry Battalion secured Abu Tor, following a fierce battle, severing the old city from Bethlehem and Hebron. Meanwhile, 600 Egyptian commandos stationed in the West Bank moved to attack Israeli airfields. Led by Jordanian intelligence scouts, they crossed the border and began infiltrating towards Israeli settlements towards Ramlah and Hatzor. They were soon detected and sought shelter in nearby fields, which the Israelis set on fire. Some 450 commandos were killed and the remainder escaped back into Jordan. Now, from the American colony, the paratroopers moved towards the Old City. Their plan was to approach the lightly defended Salah al-Din Street, but made a wrong turn into a heavily defended Nablus Road and ran into fierce resistance. The tanks fired at the point-blank range down the street, while the paratroopers mounted repeated charges. Despite repelling repeated Israeli charges, the Jordanians gradually gave way to Israeli firepower and momentum. The Israelis would suffer 30 casualties, half the original force, while the Jordanians lost 45 and had 142 wounded. Meanwhile, the Israeli 71st Battalion breached the barbed wire minefields and emerged near Wadi Jaws, near the base of Mount Scopas, from where the Old City could be cut off from Jericho and East Jerusalem from Ramallah. Israeli artillery targeted the one remaining route from Jerusalem to the West Bank, and shell fire deterred the Jordanians from counterattacking from their position at Augusta Victoria. An Israeli detachment then captured the Rockefeller Museum after a brief skirmish. Afterwards, the Israelis broke through at the Jerusalem-Ramallah Road. At Tel Aful, a Haral brigade fought a running battle with up to 30 Jordanian tanks. The Jordanians stalled the advance and destroyed some half-tracks, but the Israelis launched air attacks and exploited the vulnerability of the external fuel tanks mounted on the Jordanian tanks. You might want to put those under armor for some reason.
No.
Flames, but...
Why would we do that?
Probably because the Jordanians just lost half their tanks. They wound up retreating towards Jericho. Now, joining up with the 4th Brigade, the Israelis then descended through Shufat and the site of what is now French Hill, through Jordanian defenses at Mitvar, emerging at Ammunition Hill. Now, the Jordanian defenses in Jerusalem crumbling, and elements of the Jordanian 60th Brigade and an infantry battalion were sent from Jericho to reinforce Jerusalem. Its original orders were to repel Israelis from the Latrun corridor, but due to the worsening situation in Jerusalem, the brigade was ordered to proceed to Jerusalem's Arab suburbs and attack Mount Scopas. Parallel to the brigade were infantrymen from Imam Ali Brigade, who was approaching Asawaya. The brigade was spotted by Israeli aircraft and decimated by rocket and cannon fire, and other Jordanians' attempt to reinforce Jerusalem were beaten back either by armored ambushes or airstrikes. Now, fearing damage to the holy sites and the prospect of having to fight in built-up areas, Dayan ordered his troops not to enter the Old City. He also feared that the Israelis would be subjected to a fierce international backlash and the outrage of Christians worldwide if it forced its way into the Old City. Privately, he told David Ben-Gurion that he was also concerned over the prospect of Israel capturing Jerusalem's holy sites, only to be forced to give them up under the threat of international sanctions. Well, Israel was to gain almost total control of the West Bank by the evening of the 7th of June, and begin its military occupation of the West Bank on that day, issuing a military order, the Proclamation Regarding Law and Administration, or West Bank Area Number 2, 1967, which established a military government of the West Bank and granted the commander of the area full legislative, executive, and judicial power. Jordan realized that they had no hope of defense as early as the morning of June 6th, just a day after the conflict had begun. At Nasser's request, Egypt's Abdul Mumin Riyad sent a situation update at midday on the 6th of June. Quote, "The situation of the West Bank is rapidly deteriorating. A concentrated attack has been launched on all axes, together with heavy fire day and night. Jordanian, Syrian, and Iraqi air forces in position H3 have been virtually destroyed. Upon consultation with King Hussein, I have been asked to convey to you the following choices. Number one, a political decision to cease fighting to be imposed by a third party, the U.S., the Soviet Union, or the Security Council. To vacate the West Bank tonight. Two. Or three, to go on fighting for one more day, resulting in the isolation and destruction of the entire Jordanian army. Well, King Hussein asked me to refer this matter to you for an immediate reply. Boss! What we do, bud? An Egyptian order for Jordanian forces to withdraw across the Jordan River was issued at 10 a.m. on the 6th of June. The afternoon, King Hussein learned of the impending United Nations Security Council resolution 233 and decided instead to hold out in the hope that a ceasefire would be implemented soon. It was already too late, as the counter order caused confusion and in many cases it was not possible to regain positions that had been left. On June the 7th, Dayan ordered his troops not to enter the old city, but upon hearing the UN was about to declare a ceasefire, he changed his mind. Without cabinet clearance, decided to capture it.
Why not?
The two paratroop battalions attacked the Augusta Victoria Hill, high ground overlooking the old city from the east. One battalion attacked from Mount Scopus, and another attacked from the valley between it and the old city. Another paratroop battalion, personally led by Gur, broke into the old city and was joined by other two battalions after their missions were complete. The paratroopers met little resistance. The fighting was conducted solely by the paratroopers. The Israelis did not use armor during the battle out of fear of severe damage to the old city. Well, that's good forward thinking. In the north, a battalion from Khaled's division checked the Jordanian defenses in the Jordan Valley. A brigade from Khaled's division captured the western part of the West Bank. One brigade attacked the Jordanian artillery positions around Jenin, which was shelling Ramat David Air Base. The Jordanian 12th Armored Battalion, which outnumbered the Israelis, held off repeated attempts to capture Jenin. Israeli air attacks took their toll, and the Jordanian M48 Pattons, with their external fuel tanks, proved vulnerable at short distances, even to the Israeli-modified Shermans. 12 Jordanian tanks were destroyed and had only 6 remaining operational. Now, just after dusk, Israeli reinforcements arrived. The Jordanians continued to fiercely resist, and the Israelis were unable to advance without artillery or air support. One Israeli jet attacked the Jordanian commander's tank, wounding him and killing his radio operator and intelligence officer. The surviving Jordanian forces then withdrew to Jenin, where they were reinforced by the 25th Infantry Brigade. The Jordanians were effectively surrounded in Jenin. Jordanian infantry and their 3 remaining tanks managed to hold off the Israelis until 4 a.m., when 3 battalions arrived to reinforce them in the afternoon. The Jordanian tanks charged and knocked out multiple Israeli vehicles, and the tide began to shift. By sunrise, Israeli jets and artillery conducted a 2-hour bombardment against the Jordanians. The Jordanians lost 10, 250 wounded, and had only 7 tanks left, including 2 without gas and 16 APCs. The Israelis then fought their way into Jenin and captured the city after fierce fighting. Well, after the old city fell, and the Jerusalem Brigade reinforcing the paratroopers, it continued to the south, capturing Judea and Gush Etzion. Hebron was taken without any resistance. Fearful the Israeli soldiers would exact retribution for the 1929 massacre of the city's Jewish community, Hebron's residents flew white sheets from their windows and rooftops. The Harel Brigade proceeded eastward, descending onto the Jordan River. On the 7th of June, Israeli forces seized Bethlehem, taking the city after a brief battle in which some 40 Jordanian soldiers died, with the remainder fleeing. On the same day, one of Peled's brigades seized Nablus. Then it joined one of the Central Command's armored brigades to fight the Jordanian forces. As the Jordanians held the advantage of superior equipment and were equal in numbers to the Israelis, again the air superiority proved paramount as it immobilized the Jordanians, leading to their defeat. One of Peled's brigades joined with the Central Command's counterparts coming from Ramallah, and the remaining 2 blocked the Jordan River's crossings. Together with Central Command's 10th Engineering Corps, sappers blew up the Abdullah and Hussein bridges with captured Jordanian mortar shells, while elements of the Harel Brigade crossed the river and occupied opposite positions. along the east banks to cover them, but quickly pulled back due to American pressure. The Jordanians, anticipating an Israeli offensive deep into Jordan, assembled the remnants of their army and Iraqi units in Jordan to protect the western approaches to Amman and southern slopes of the Golan Heights. At that point, okay, break out your maps, kids.
No maps.
They'd just taken the West Bank, and they still had air superiority. They were within miles of Amman. On the southern front, they had fought all the way through the Sinai Peninsula, and they were sitting at the Suez Canal. And Cairo was right across the way. So, here it is. This is, 4 days in, and all this has happened. This is getting crazy. Now, as Israel continued its offensive on the 7th, taking no account for the UN ceasefire resolution, the Egyptian Jordanian command ordered a full Jordanian withdrawal for the second time in order to avoid annihilation of the Jordanian army. This was complete by nightfall of the 7th of June. Well, after the old city was captured, Dayan told his troops to dig in to hold it. When an armored brigade commander entered the West Bank on his own initiative and stated he could see Jericho, Dayan ordered him back. It was only after intelligence reports indicated that Hussein had withdrawn his forces across the Jordan River and that Dayan ordered his troops to capture the West Bank. According to Narcus, first, the Israeli government had no intention of capturing the West Bank. On the contrary, he was opposed to it. Secondly, there was not any provocation on the part of the IDF. Third, the rein was only loosened when the real threat to Jerusalem's security emerged. This is how things happened on the 5th of June, although it is difficult to believe. The result was something that no one had planned. Now,
There they go, trying to make plans.
yeah, the final stage then was pretty much set. In May to June 1967, in preparation for conflict, the Israeli government planned to confine the confrontation to the Egyptian front while taking into account the possibility of some fighting on the Syrian front. Syria had pretty much, for the first 4 days, stayed out of the conflict. False Egyptian reports of a crushing victory against the Israeli army and forecasts that the Egyptian forces would soon be attacking Tel Aviv influenced Syria's decision to enter the war in sporadic manner during this period. Syrian artillery began shelling northern Israel, and 12 Syrian jets attacked Israeli settlements in the Galilee. Israeli fighter jets intercepted the Syrian aircraft, shooting down 3 and driving off the rest. In addition, 2 Lebanese Hawker Hunter jets, 2 of the 12 Lebanon had, crossed into Israeli airspace and began strafing Israeli positions in the Galilee. Well, they were intercepted by Israeli fighter jets, and 1 was shot down. Well, on the evening of the 5th of June, the Israeli Air Force attacked the Syrian airfields. The Syrian Air Force lost some 32 MiG-21s, 23 MiG-15s, and MiG-17 fighters, and 2 Ilyushin Il-28 bombers, 2/3 of its fighting strength. Now, here's something else also to consider on this. And this is just kind of mind-boggling. On the UN Security Council, you have the Soviet Union, who's been selling planes like hotcakes. Now, 90% of their air that they've been selling is cratered and burning and unable to use the runways. It doesn't exactly bode well for their, pocketbook.
I don't know.
French-built planes are blowing them up. It's just not good, Houston. Oh, they need to train their pilots better. But the Syrian aircraft that survived the attack retreated to distant bases and played no further role in the war. Get us out of here! Following the attack, Syria realized that the news it had received from Egypt, the near total destruction of the Israeli military, could not have been true. Really?
No.
On the 6th of June, a minor Syrian force tried to capture the water plants at Tel Dam, the subject of a fierce escalation 2 years earlier, Dan and Shura Yazba. These attacks were repulsed with the loss of 20 soldiers and 7 tanks. An Israeli officer was also killed, but a broader Syrian offensive quickly failed. Syrian reserve units were broken up by Israeli air attacks, and several tanks were reported to have sunk in the Jordan River. Oops, you mean those don't float?
Apparently.
The other problems included tanks being too wide for bridges, lack of radio communications between tanks, and infantry and units ignoring orders to advance. A post-war Syrian army report concluded, our forces did not go on the offensive either because they did not arrive or were not wholly prepared, or because they could not find shelter from the enemy aircraft. The reserves could not withstand the air attacks. They were dispersed after their morale plummeted. Well, the Syrians bombarded Israeli civilian settlements in the Galilee Panhandle with 2 battalions of M46 130 millimeter guns, 4 companies of heavy mortars, and Duggan Panzer IV tanks. I'm not kidding. That's actually a World War II tank.
Woo!
You guys are really pushing the envelope. Syrian bombardment killed 2 civilians and hit 205 houses, as well as farming installations. Oh, that tractor was a hazard.
No.
Well, an inaccurate report from the Syrian officer said that as a result of the bombardment, the enemy appears to have suffered heavy losses and is retreating. Now, the 7th and 8th of June, the Israeli leadership was debating on whether to attack the Golan Heights as well. Syria had supported pre-war raids, helped raise tensions, and routinely shelled Israel from the heights. So some Israeli leaders wanted to see Syria punished. Don't blame them. Military opinion was that an attack would be extremely costly, since it would entail an uphill battle against a strongly fortified enemy. The western side of the Golan Heights consists of a rock escarpment which rises 1,700 feet from the Sea of Galilee and the Jordan River, then flattens to a gently sloping plateau. Diane opposed the operation bitterly at first, believing such an undertaking would result in losses of 30,000 men and might trigger Soviet intervention. Prime Minister Eshkol, on the other hand, was more open to the possibility, as was the head of the Northern Command, David Elazar, whose unbridled enthusiasm for and confidence in the operation may have eroded Diane's reluctance. Well, eventually, the situation of the southern and central fronts cleared up. Intelligence estimated that the likelihood of Soviet intervention had been reduced. Reconnaissance showed some Syrian defenses in the Golan region collapsing, and an intercepted cable revealed Nasser was urging the president of Syria immediately to accept a ceasefire. At 3 a.m. on the 9th of June, Syria announced an acceptance of a ceasefire. Despite the announcement, Diane had become more enthusiastic about the idea, and 4 hours later, at 7 a.m., gave the order to go ahead into action against Syria, without consultation or government authorization. Well, the Syrian army consisted of about 75,000 men, grouped in 9 brigades, supported by an adequate amount of artillery and armor. Israel forces used in combat consisted of 2 brigades, the 8th Armored Brigade and the Golani Brigade, in the northern part of the front at Givat Harim, and another 2 infantry and 1 of Peled's brigades summoned in from Jenin in the center. The Golan Heights' unique terrain, mountainous slopes crossed by parallel streams every several kilometers running east to west, and the general lack of roads in the area channeled both forces along the east-west axis of movement and restricted the ability of units to support those on either flank. Thus, the Syrians could move north and south on the plateau itself, and the Israelis could move north-south at the base of the Golan Escarpment. An advantage Israel possessed was the intelligence collected by Mossad operative Eli Cohen, who sadly was later captured and executed in Syria in 1965, regarding the Syrian battle positions. Syria had built extensive defensive fortifications in depths up to 15 kilometers. Well, as opposed to other campaigns, the IAF was only partially effective in Golan because fixed fortifications were so effective. The Syrian forces proved unable to be put in effective defense, largely because the officers were poor leaders and treated their soldiers badly. Often officers would retreat from danger, leaving their men confused and ineffective. The Israelis also had the upper hand during close combat that took place in the numerous Syrian bunkers along the Golan Heights, as they were armed with the Uzi, submachine gun designed for close combat, while Syrian soldiers were armed with the heavier AK-47 assault rifle, designed for combat in more open areas. Well, on the morning of the 9th of June, the Israeli jets began pounding out dozens of sorties against the Syrian positions from Mount Hermon to Tafwik, using rockets salvaged from captured Egyptian stocks. The airstrikes knocked out artillery batteries and storehouses and forced transport columns off the roads. The Syrians suffered heavy casualties and a drop in morale, with some senior officers and troops deserting. The attacks also provided time as Israeli forces cleared paths through Syrian minefields. The airstrikes did not seriously damage the Syrian bunkers and trench systems, and the bulk of Syrian forces on the Golan remained in their positions. Well, after about 2 hours after the airstrikes began, the 8th Armored Brigade, led by Colonel Albert Mandler, advanced into the Golan Heights from Gavat Haim. Its advance was spearheaded by Engineering Corps sappers and 8 bulldozers, which cleared away barbed wire and mines. As they advanced, the force came under fire, and 5 bulldozers were immediately hit. The Israeli tanks, with their maneuverability sharply reduced by the terrain, advanced slowly under fire towards the fortified village at Sir al-Dib, with their ultimate objective being the fortress at Kuala. Israeli casualties steadily mounted. Well, part of the attacking force lost its way and emerged opposite Zara, a redoubt manned by Syrian reservists. With the situation critical, Colonel Mandler ordered simultaneous assaults on Zara and Kuala. Heavy and confused fighting followed, with Israelis and Syrian tanks struggling around obstacles and firing at extremely short ranges. Mandler recalled that the Syrians fought well in bloodiness. We beat them only by crushing under their treads and by blasting them with our cannons at very short range, some 100 to 500 meters. The first 3 Israeli tanks to enter Kuala were stopped by a Syrian bazooka team, and a relief column of 7 Syrian tanks arrived to repel the attackers. Now, the Israelis took heavy fire from the houses, but could not turn back as other forces were advancing behind them, and they were on a narrow path with mines on either side. The Israelis continued pushing forward and called for air support. A pair of Israeli jets destroyed 2 of the Syrian tanks, and the remainder withdrew. The surviving defenders, Kuala, retreated after the commander was killed. Meanwhile, Zuwala fell to an Israeli assault, and the Israelis captured the infant fortress. In the central sector, the Israeli 181st Battalion captured the strongholds at Darda and Tel Ahal after fierce fighting. Desperate fighting also broke out along the operation's northern axis, where a Golani brigade attacked 13 Syrian positions, including the formidable Tal Farkar position. Navigational errors placed the Israelis directly under the Syrians' guns. The fighting that followed, both sides took heavy casualties, with the Israelis losing all 19 of their tanks and half-tracks. The Israeli battalion commander then ordered his 25 remaining men to dismount, divide into 2 groups, and charge the northern and southern flanks of Tel Fakir. The first Israelis to reach the perimeter of the southern approach laid on the barbed wire, allowing comrades to vault over them. From there, they assaulted the fortified Syrian positions. The fighting was waged in extremely close quarters, often hand-to-hand. Now, on the northern flank, the Israelis broke through within minutes and cleared out the trenches and bunkers. During the 7-hour battle, the Israelis lost 31 and 82 wounded, while the Syrians would lose 62 dead and 20 captured. Among the dead was the Israeli battalion commander. The Golani Brigade's 51st Battalion took Tel Azazat, and Darbashira also fell to Israeli forces. Well, by that evening of the 9th, the 4 Israeli brigades had all broken through to the plateau, where they could be reinforced and replaced. Thousands of reinforcements again reaching the front. Those tanks and half-tracks that had survived the previous day's fighting were refueled and replenished with ammunition, and the wounded were evacuated. By dawn, the Israelis had 8 brigades in the sector. Well, the Syrians' first line of defense had been shattered, but the defenses beyond remained largely intact. Mount Hermon and Banas in the north, and the entire sector between Tawfiq and the Customs House Road in the south remained in Syrian hands. Meeting early on the 9th of June, Syrian leaders decided to reinforce those positions as quickly as possible and to maintain a steady barrage on Israeli civilian settlements. Now, throughout the night, the Israelis continued their advance, though it was slowed by fierce resistance, and anticipated Syrian counterattack never materialized. At the fortified village of Jabalana, a garrison of Syrian reservists, leveling their anti-aircraft guns, held off an Israeli 65th Paratroop Battalion for 4 hours before a small detachment managed to penetrate the village and knock out the heavy guns. Meanwhile, the 8th Brigade's tanks moved south from Kuala, advancing 6 miles to Wazin under heavy artillery and tank bombardment. At the Banas in the north, Syrian mortar battles opened fire on advancing Israeli forces only after Golani Brigade saptors cleared a path through the minefield, killing 16 soldiers and wounding 4. On the next day, on the 10th, the central and northern groups joined in a pincer movement on the plateau, but that fell mainly on empty territory as the Syrian forces retreated. At 8:30 a.m., the Syrians began blowing up their own bunkers, burning documents, and retreating. Several units, joined by Elad Palet's troops, climbed to the Golan from the south, only to find positions mostly empty. When the 8th Brigade reached Mansoura, 5 miles from Wazet, the Israelis met no opposition and found abandoned equipment, including tanks, in perfect working condition. Hey guys, I got a souvenir tank!
I gotta use it.
What's that button do? Oh, shoot. Yes, it did. But in the fortified Banas village, Golani Brigade's troops found only several Syrian soldiers chained to their positions.
Whoops.
Uh,
Guess you're not leaving your post.
Thanks, Commander. During the day, Israeli units stopped after obtaining maneuver room between their positions and a line of volcanic hills to the west. In some locations, Israeli troops advanced after the agreed upon ceasefire to occupy strategically strong positions. To the east, the ground terrain is open, gently sloping plain. The position later became the ceasefire line, known as the Purple Line. Time magazine would report, in an effort to pressure the United Nations into enforcing a ceasefire, Damascus Radio undercut its own army by broadcasting the fall of the city of Quintara 3 hours before it actually capitulated. That premature report of the surrender of their headquarters destroyed the morale of Syrian troops left in the Golan area. Now, as they take a talk about, by the 10th, Israel had completed its final offensive in the Golan Heights. A ceasefire was signed the day after Israel had seized the Gaza Strip, the Sinai Peninsula, the West Bank, and the Golan Heights. About 1 million Arabs were placed under Israel's direct control and the newly captured territories. Israel's strategic depth grew to at least 300 millimeters to the south, 60 kilometers to the east, and 20 kilometers of extremely rugged terrain to the north. This security asset would prove useful later in the Yom Kippur War 6 years later. Speaking 3 weeks after the war ended, as he accepted an honorary degree from Hebrew University, Yitzhak Rabin gave the reasoning behind the success of Israel. He said, "Our men, who struck the enemy's plans so accurately that no one in the world understands how it was done, and people seek technological explanations or secret weapons. Our armored troops who beat their enemy even when their equipment was inferior to his. Our soldiers in all other branches who overcame our enemies everywhere, despite the latter's superior numbers and fortifications. All these revealed not only coolness but courage in the battle, but an understanding that only their personal stand against the greatest dangers would achieve victory for their country and for their families, and that if victory was not theirs, the alternative was annihilation." But with
win or die. Cool. I said win or die.
Basically. And, thanks to those actions, they basically set out call it breathing space. Of course, later on they would trade some of that land back for peace. They wound up making a deal with Egypt and gave up the Sinai in partition. The West Bank, while technically it's still Israeli, it's mostly considered a living area for the Palestinians. Same with the Gaza Strip. Now that in its own is a story that's playing out right now. But that's been the fun of the 6-Day War. I hope you folks have found something interesting to study off of. This has been the Bearded Historian from the Bud Files. We will catch you guys next week.
I'm going to have a lot of fun trying to find pictures for this.
Oh, I bet.
It's over an hour and a half.
Wow.